Ya estamos grabando, sí. Saludos y buenas tardes a todos en este día tan especial. Mi nombre es Gabriel Rodríguez. Soy el director de la tesis de nuestro próximo estudiante que voy a presentar ya mismo. Conmigo me acompaña a Lauzardo Ugarte y Luis García Nevares, también van a ser lectores, fungen también profesores en traducción aquí. Y también administrativo, Bárbara Medina está con nosotros. Y hoy estamos aquí para una ocasión muy especial que es la defensa de tesis de Stephanie Newton. Stephanie, una estudiante que nos ha llegado desde el estado de Boston, hemos estado varios años en el programa y decir que es una persona con muchos talentos es poco. O sea, esta persona es una persona que se ha dado a conocer tanto por su trabajo también como por sus hobbies y su personalidad que es bien carismática. Así que sin más preámbulo voy a dejar que Stephanie tome la batuta desde aquí con su presentación de la tesis. Así que Steph, cuando estés lista.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Gabriel. Let me just set up my slideshow here. All right, let me know if at any point you can't see the slideshow or anything you need to be seeing.
Loud and clear.
So thank you so much for the introduction and welcome everyone to my thesis defense. I will be presenting my project, Put on a Happy Face, which is a translation of a selection of short stories from the book Cuentos de Buena Cara by Ricardo Martí Ruiz. If you're watching the live stream on YouTube, please write your name in the chat so that I know you're here and I can thank you later on. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves also in the chat. I won't be able to see it during the actual presentation, but I'll take a look at it later on. Sandra Henry Alvarez was one of my professors at the Boston University Interpreter Training Program back in 2018. She was the utmost example of excellence in her profession and was also just a genuinely kind and cheerful soul. And we were developing a mentor-mentee relationship at the time that she got sick and passed away. This thesis project is dedicated to Sandra. I also want to acknowledge a few people in particular for their role in this project. Thank you to Gabriel, my thesis advisor, for lively conversations during class, for helping me with every translation challenge that I came across, and for always making time to share pictures of our pets. Thank you to Luis for teaching me the tools of the trade, for helping me talk through career dilemmas, and for correcting the grammar in all of my text messages. Thank you to Aurora for paving the way to the UPR for me when I had decided not to start grad school after all, and also for always being willing to go for a walk, even when it was hard to find a parking space. And lastly, thank you to the immensely talented rare bird, Ricardo Martí Ruiz, for being willing to open your writing to the close reading of a translator and for trusting me with your art. All right, now that I've lightly roasted all of my professors who are about to give me my final grade, let's get started. In today's presentation, you're going to learn about the storyteller, and I say storyteller instead of author because that is Ricardo's personal preference. You'll also learn about the text or the book that I translated a part of, my approach to translating it, and some examples of the main translation challenges that I came across. Let's start with learning a little bit about the storyteller. Ricardo Martí Ruiz calls himself a cuentista realengo, which means a stray storyteller. As he himself explains, I've always considered myself a bit of a strange bird in the literary world, a black sheep or an ugly duckling, perhaps. What I do is different from the norm, and that suits me. The storyteller's writing style is simultaneously unique and comedic, but also very readable, very accessible for a wide range of audiences, and often includes a lot of wordplay, which I love and is one of the reasons I chose to translate his stories. His stories are very relatable and often silly, but with serious underlying themes. He has written a broad repertoire of books, from books of short stories to even a couple graphic novels, and he's won awards for several of his books and short stories. In addition to his literary contributions to the world, Ricardo has had a big impact on the community of people with Parkinson's disease, drawing from his own experience of having been diagnosed at a young age. He actually started a group for people with Parkinson's to support each other, and he's been a grounding voice for many people when they're newly diagnosed. A lot of his life experience, both with Parkinson's and just other bits and pieces of everyday life, show up in his literature in creative ways. He also incorporates fantasy and a lot of imagination into his writing. So let me tell you a little bit more about the book itself, Cuentos de buena cara. This book was published in 2021. It's a book of short stories that was written in Spanish, which I translated select stories of into English. And I would categorize the genre of this book as satire, because it pokes fun at the state of the world. And I chose this genre because satire plays a significant role in social and political resistance, and it's important to me to amplify voices of resistance in Puerto Rico so that they reach beyond Puerto Rico. Let me show you an example of how this shows up in the book. The excerpt that I'm about to show is from a story that criticizes the government's lack of transparency and the theft of people's agency over their own lives. The sentence reads, and this is from my translation, "The boss received an official call around 9 p.m. from someone important, located somewhere, who said something so commanding that Jimmy had to let us go home." And the vagueness of this quote is so ludicrous that it's funny, but the reader knows that the implications are serious. Other common themes of the short stories are corruption, toxic relationships, exploitation capitalism, and colonialism. The book contains 32 stories in total, but that was too long for me to translate all of them for the parameters of the thesis, and so I had to pick about half of them. I do want to translate the rest of them at some point. So for this project, I chose the ones that present the most translation challenges so that I could take advantage of having this presentation, having a thesis advisor, and having my thesis committee so that I could ask questions and bounce ideas off of for the stories that I thought would present more challenges. These are the 16 stories that I've translated with the Spanish source text on the left. And in translation, the source text is the text that is being translated from is called the source text, rather than what a lot of people naturally think to say, which is original text. And that's because a lot of texts are not necessarily original text, depending on what your definition of original is. But the text you're translating may be a compilation of other texts, or it may actually be a translation itself. So on the left, you can see the names of the short stories from the source text from the book Cuentos de buena cara, and on the right is my English translation of the 16 stories, of the titles of the 16 stories that I translated. To give you a quick preview of the main translation challenges that I came across, a lot of the stories had idioms and wordplay, these two in particular. Some of the stories had slang and profanity, and other stories were more poetic and had a lot of metaphor, all of which present with challenges when you're trying to translate them. To share a little bit with you about my approach to how I translated the book, I want to share a little bit from a video that Ricardo created and posted, which is called The 3 Questions. So he brings up 3 questions to ask yourself before you start to write. The 3 questions are, what do you want to write? For whom are you writing? And why the fuck are you writing? And I love these 3 questions because they exactly match the 3 steps I take for myself when I'm starting a translation process. So when I receive a text to translate, then first I familiarize myself with what is in the text, what is written. Then I determine who the audience will be, who is the target audience for this translation. So for whom am I translating? And then I determine what the translation's goal is. So why the fuck am I translating this text? Let's focus a little bit more on audience and goal. For this project, to decide what translation strategy I was going to use, I had to determine who my audience was. So I believe that a translation of this book will be appealing to English speakers in the US and Puerto Rico. And so that will already start to give me some clues as to what kind of language I should use in my translation. And I set my goal as convey the message through humor and within the context of Puerto Rico. So whenever I faced a translation challenge, I came back to this goal to make sure that whatever translation I ended up with, whatever the words that I chose were, it matched the humor of the source text as much as I could and also stayed within the Puerto Rican context of Ricardo's text. So now that I have determined my audience and my goal, I can decide on an approach. And I'm going to share a framework for an approach developed by translation theorist Lawrence Venuti. Imagine that you are in a Puerto Rican bookstore and you find the book Cuentos de buena cara. It was written for a Puerto Rican audience, but you want to translate it for a United States audience. Lawrence Venuti describes two possible strategies for your translation. One possible strategy is called the foreignization strategy. What this means is that in your translation into English of this Puerto Rican book, you maintain Puerto Rican cultural references, making the translation more foreign to US readers. Or you can choose a domestication strategy. So when you domesticate your translation, you may swap out Puerto Rican cultural references for US cultural references. This makes the translation more familiar to the reader, but it sacrifices aspects of the culture that the book comes from. For example, imagine that your book is talking about a Christmas dinner. In Puerto Rico, a common Christmas time food is called pasteles. Using a foreignization strategy, you might leave the Spanish word pasteles in your translation, even though the book your translation is in English, because there's no equivalent word for pasteles in English. So the word will be foreign to the readers, but it will be authentic to Puerto Rican culture. On the other hand, using a domestication strategy, you might take out pasteles and substitute it with Christmas ham, for example. So that reference will be familiar to your readers, but you will have lost the Puerto Rican-ness of the reference. Neither strategy is good or bad. It all depends on what your goal is for the translation. And so for this particular translation, I adopted a mix of these two strategies in what I'm calling a domestication of language, foreignization of setting strategy, because my two goals were the humor and the context of Puerto Rico. And so I really wanted the humor and the idiomatic wordplay to be central to the writing. And I felt that the best way to do that was to choose idioms and language that was really familiar to my target audience, because that's how Ricardo writes. His humor is central to his writing, so I wanted to honor that. In this way, I domesticated the language. However, because I also really wanted the translation to be grounded in a Puerto Rican setting, because that's also central to the stories, I preserved geographic references whenever I could, which means I foreignized the setting. And you'll see examples of this throughout my presentation. The challenges that I approached in the translation, I grouped roughly into three categories: contextual, linguistic, and stylistic. And I'll give a couple examples of each one. Let's start with contextual challenges. And when I say contextual, what I mean is the cultural, historical, geographical, and political context surrounding the text. So these can be either more subtle references, or they can be more explicit culture-specific items. which is a term coined by Javier Franco Ayxela. And a culture-specific item is a term or concept that's really specific to the culture. For example, the curse of the Bambino, which is the superstition that the Red Sox was cursed when Babe Ruth left the team to join the Yankees, is a culture-specific item because it's very rooted in US culture and it might be hard to translate that into other languages and other cultures. So let's look at some of the examples of these contextual challenges that I came across. The first one I'm going to share is a story which was probably the most difficult story to translate, and it's called Capítulo 11, Subordinadas. This story was very challenging because the whole story, and therefore a lot of words in the story, have a double meaning. So the story was designed to look like a chapter of a grammar textbook that is teaching subordinate clauses or dependent clauses. They're the same thing. So if this were just a grammar lesson, I would translate subordinadas in this title here to subordinate clauses. Because in English, when we're talking about grammar, we wouldn't just say subordinates, we would say subordinate clauses. However, this chapter is a metaphor for the political subordination of Puerto Rico and the failings of the education system. So in my translation, I had to preserve this double meaning, which meant that I couldn't say subordinate clauses because the second meaning of the political and social context would be lost. That translation wouldn't work for that meaning. And this happened a few times throughout this chapter. So what I did in this case was I did a literal translation. I translated it as chapter 11, subordinates. And so this translation works it mostly works for both of those contexts, the grammar context and the political context, but I did have to make a sacrifice to fluidity. By that, I mean, it sounds a little bit awkward to say subordinates to refer to grammar. Another example is when the term La Cordillera Central came up in one of the stories. And the challenge is that Cordillera Central in English, according to all the references I found, is spelled exactly the same way. But a lot of the readers might not be familiar with what La Cordillera Central is. La Cordillera Central is the mountain range that runs through the center of Puerto Rico. And in this particular story, there's a huge earthquake going on, a huge storm, and there are these guttural grinding sounds coming from the earth. And the line says that it's like the Cordillera Central itself was growling. And if you know that this is a mountain range, it adds so much to the imagery of the story because you can just picture the mountains kind of moving and grinding against each other. And so I really wanted the readers to know what La Cordillera Central is. So the strategy I used was to explain what it is very briefly using what is called an apositive. An apositive is when two words of the same part of speech are put next to each other, one to explain the other. It usually happens with nouns. So what this looks like is I added in Puerto Rico's mountainous center, the Cordillera Central. And so that's a really brief explanation of what it is so readers can pick up on the imagery of the story, but it doesn't interrupt the story too much. The next group of challenges that I came across were linguistic challenges. And when I say linguistic, I mean elements of the words themselves. So this could be idioms, slang, profanity, and grammatical differences between the two languages. The first example I want to share is from one of the stories, which was actually a poem. The line is, Ni batas el cobre sin saber pormenores, del pobre que bates, la sangre que moles. And I spent a really long time with these two lines because they are a reference to an idiom, but they play with the words of the idiom themselves, and they use some wordplay that comes from the idiom. And so I did a lot of research on this, and I also talked to Ricardo himself so that I could get a better idea of the meaning that he wanted to come from these two lines. The other thing was that the imagery here is very strong. It talks about it. Batas el cobre literally means to beat the copper, and it comes from people who it's an idiom that comes from people who work with copper, and so you have to physically beat the copper with a hammer to work with it. And then the second line, it actually refers to beating a person, and it refers to blood, and so it's very graphic. And when I talked to Ricardo about his thought process behind this line, what he said was that the meaning he wanted people to extract was that when you feel like, so the idiom that he's using means you do what you do to have to, you do what you have to do to get something done. But his caution in this poem is to be aware of the unintended consequences of what you do when you're just trying to get something done. And so I did find an idiom in English that somewhat matches this, which is to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. But because this is one of his more serious stories in terms of tone, I felt like that idiom was a little bit too silly for the tone of this poem. And so I found what is called a dynamic equivalent of the idiom. So I didn't translate the words literally. I found an equivalent that I hoped would have a similar effect on the audience. And I ended up translating it as, when you're pushing through to the end, be aware of the means that you're justifying. I feel that what I preserved in this translation is the meaning that the storyteller was trying to get across, and the fact that an idiom was used in the poem. However, I do feel like I sacrificed a lot of the imagery because this was just a very, very hard line to translate, and I just couldn't figure out a way to work it in. And I also sacrificed the rhyme. So the source text rhymes a little bit, and I don't have that in my translation. And so if we end up trying to publish this translation, I would actually probably work more on this line to see if I can get either of those things in and try to make it sound a little more fluid. As it is, I spent a lot of time working on this one, but it's just like writing or making art where you're never actually quite done with the translation. You can always play with it more. Another example of a challenge in terms of linguistics, and this is my favorite challenge from the whole book, is the word charref. So charref is a portmanteau, which means that it's a combination of two words. And the two words that it's combining are a slang word and another made-up word. To understand this, it helps to have some background. So the story that this shows up in is a sequel to Jorge Luis Borges's story, El Aleph. In the story El Aleph, an Aleph, which is an invented concept, is a small spherical point in time and space where if you look into it, you can see everything that has ever happened and will happen in the world. So it's a fantastical concept. In Ricardo's story, which is the sequel to El Aleph, the main character comes across an Aleph, but when he looks into it, he finds everything terrible that has ever happened in the world and everything terrible that will happen in the world. And so he describes this Aleph as charro. Charro is a Puerto Rican slang word that means, in some cases, means tacky or bad taste. For example, un chiste charro would be a tacky joke. However, tacky doesn't quite match it because we don't use tacky with quite the same frequency or in all the situations that charro would be used in Puerto Rico. And so there's no exact equivalent of charro in English. So the way that I translated this was that I really wanted to maintain the portmanteau. So I wanted my translation to be also a combination of the word aleph and another word that was used to describe the aleph. And so I wanted to preserve the humor. In doing that, I felt like I had to sacrifice the cultural specificity of the slang. And so this ended up being a domestication strategy where I moved the translation towards what was familiar to the readers, and I had to sacrifice a little bit of the cultural use of language. In the end, I decided that this was okay because in the previous few sentences in the story, the sentences really ground the story in Puerto Rico and the US and their relationship between them, which is what the story is about. And so I felt that the reader was already grounded in that setting, and so it was okay if it's a little bit lost in this term. It was most important to me to preserve the humor because this is actually the punchline to the whole story. So some other options that I came up with were garbeth, eye rolleth, foolishness, asif, al-ugh, idiot, and buffooneth. None of them sounded quite right to me. I didn't feel like they rolled off the tongue. And so what I came up with in the end was ridiculous. Another linguistic challenge was profanity. So this sentence, no jodas, comes at the end of the copyright page. So the copyright page has all this legalese explaining that reproducing this book without permission is punishable by fine. It's very formal. And then this sentence comes up at the end, which means don't fuck with me. The challenge in this is that it's always hard to translate profanity because profanity has such specific meanings according to the circumstance. And also the abrupt change in register. And when I say register, I mean how formal or informal the writing is. The abrupt change in register from very formal legal language to very informal profanity needed to be captured. Some other options I considered are don't fuck around, don't fuck up. I'm just putting all these here so that I get to say fuck in my thesis defense. But this happens a lot of time in translation because we come across all sorts of language. The first two I didn't feel like quite matched because they weren't specific enough to the action of reproducing a text without permission, I felt. And then a couple others I came up with, don't mess with me, don't mess with my book. Those lose the profanity. So it loses the abrupt change in register. So I ended up coming up with another dynamic equivalent, which means that I didn't translate it literally, but I came up with a sentence that I felt would have a similar impact on the reader. And I ended up with don't even fucking think about it. All right, the last linguistic challenge I want to share is again from chapter 11, subordinadas. And this story was very difficult to translate because the chapter gives a bunch of examples of subordinate clauses, and then it says, here's a list of different types of subordinate clauses, and then it provides an example for each type. And in the example sentences is where you see the story come together about the metaphor of Puerto Rico. And so the example sentences were really important and where the story was. When I translated the story into English, the grammar didn't work. The grammar ended up being incorrect. And so I felt that that would be distracting to a reader who knows a little bit about grammar. And so what I ended up doing was I used a translation strategy called substitution, where I kept the example sentences as similar as I could, but I substituted the headings of each type of subordinate clause with a type that actually fit the sentence. And so, for example, in this example, the original sentence is a noun clause, but in my translation, it ended up being an adverb clause. And so I just substituted it with adverb clause and kept the same example. Here you can see all the different types of categories, all the different categories of noun clauses that were listed in the text. And so you can see that there were 10 example sentences in the source text. And in the target text, I maintained the 10 example sentences and I kept them as similar as possible, but I ended up with 6 noun clauses and 4 adverb clauses. And this was something that I talked to Ricardo about and ran by him. All right, the last category of challenge that I want to give you some examples of were stylistic challenges. And when I say stylistic, I'm referring to language chosen by the storyteller to give the text its unique voice. And some examples of this are register and rhyming. For example, in this example, what we have here is a very formal way of describing a man who is happily eating a snack. But the register is very formal. And this continues throughout the whole story. The story is actually a pastiche, a copy in style of a text that exists that was written in the 1500s that's very formal. And so there are also many unusual variations in sentence structure to make it sound really formal. What I did was I used a writing strategy called defamiliarization, which is to take something that's familiar and make it unfamiliar in your writing. This is the strategy one of the strategies that Ricardo used in his story as well. And I also worked in unusual variations in sentence structure in my translation to also make it sound very formal. For example, part of my translation of this sentence is, in a state of bliss, with nary a touch of malice to be found, our Gustavo could be found dining on an empanadilla, etc., etc. So as you can see, it's a really flowery way of describing someone who's eating an empanadilla. The last example that I want to share is from the poem. In these 2 lines, you can see that the last 2 words, mediocres and emboben, slightly rhyme. This is a type of imperfect rhyme called assonance, which means that the vowels have similar sounds, but the consonants differ. So you can hear that mediocres and emboben both have an O and an E sound. And rhyming is very challenging to translate. So the strategy I ended up using was that I also worked imperfect rhyme into the poem as much as I could, but I didn't necessarily restrict myself to always using assonance, which is the vowels are similar, consonants are different. What I did in this particular line was the last two words are prizes and alibis. So it's an imperfect rhyme. They both have the I's sound. They don't exactly rhyme, but they sound somewhat similar. I want to close by thanking everyone who's here today. It means so much to me that you're using this presentation to avoid working, and also that you love me and support me, of course. And I hope I can always do the same for you. You are simultaneously out of this world, all over the globe, and close to my heart. Thank you.
All right. So, I mean, I think we can end it there. The presentation was perfect, right? I'm joking.
Bye, me voy.
One of the things that drew Steph and me for for a collaboration was the humor. Steph, like myself, we like humor, we like comedy, and we've always been wondering how can we translate humor, how can we translate comedy, and it's never easy because just like a literary or translating a poem, for example, there has to be you have to have your goal in mind, but there has to be a high level of creativity when you approach this. And Steph, I believe, is a very creative person and is even more brave in taking this task of translating a book such as this. So immediately I enjoyed the project and I even told her. But whenever we would discuss some of these challenges, sometimes we would leave the conversation midway because there were no full answers, right? There was not a final it's like she said, it's a work in progress that you'll always keep coming back to and keep evaluating. I could have done this, I could have done that. So it's always a negotiation. And translations is exactly that. It's an ongoing negotiation between two languages, two cultures, two dynamics that are externally, if you look at them, incompatible, but we make them, the translators, we make them compatible. That's what we do as translators, okay? So that's why I appreciate a lot that Steph would entrust me with this project to direct, and I'll always be forever grateful for her and for experience because she's a great student. So let me move on now to the readers that we have here. Who wants to go first between Aurora and Luis? Who's willing to give some other comments about the reading?
¿Esa mano qué quiere decir, Luis?
Go ahead.
Que empiece yo.
All right, okay.
Okay.
Aurora.
No, I'm fighting away with my computer. It's really slow.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
So go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, Stephanie, thank you for inviting me to your thesis. I feel so honored to be here. And of course, I am so proud of you. And I'm so proud of Gabriel when I see him. And when I see Luis, you know, you guys, you were there as students. And when I see you, I feel so proud of you guys. I really do. So thank you for this honor. And thank you for those nice walks that we shared in the Jardín Botánico, and for being so wonderful, and for also being like a voice for the students during the pandemic, which I have to say this, that you created these chats, and I remember calling you so many times to tell you, what do the students think? Tell me, you know, and help me keep a communication with the students at a time where it was very difficult. So I do appreciate your leadership and your generosity in the program to maintain the learning community that we have always been. So thank you very, very much. You have been very important in these past years. And I would like to say that I enjoyed very much your translation. I am an instant fan of the storyteller. Absolutely, I'm an instant fan. I saw his video, and I would tell everyone to see and know him better. Truly extraordinary human being. And I was talking with Luis yesterday. We were commenting a little bit because we had read the thesis, and certainly your translation reads so well. Your translation is light in the good sense of the word, and I think you did a very good job in your translation. I would like to point, I sent you yesterday my comments, so you know some of the things that I'm going to ask you. So I will, let's begin by the preface, because the preface pretty much contains most of my doubts that are then reflected in the translation, in the text. So let's begin with the preface, and as we always do this is a conversation, okay? And Luis can interrupt whenever he wants, or wait and not interrupt and then comment. So about the titles, and I thought about this as you were giving your presentation, so this is, I don't know if this is exactly in the notes that I sent you yesterday, but and this is a question mostly. Did you consider subordination as a title for subordinados? Because subordination is a grammar concept, right? So
Yes. I did consider it. I think that I still felt like it was a little bit too heavy on the political side, and because I think that subordination would be a grammatical term for what is happening in subordinate clauses, but it's not a term that I actually hear
Okay.
when referring to grammar. But that's something that I could continue thinking about.
Okay. No, and it is a question. I like what you did with
Mhm.
subordinates, and I am okay. Luis and I were talking last night, and every translation is an act of domestication. It's inevitable because you are making it legible to another culture and to another language. So, de facto and por default, ¿verdad? It is a process of domestication. And so I am okay with making the reader feel a little bit uncomfortable. I always say, okay, so it sounds like a translation. I mean, I'm not talking about a bad translation, but if the reader feels a little bit uncomfortable, I think that's fine, because translation is a political act too. And so you want the reader to be sometimes not as ease as they can. And truly, right now with Google and with the access that we have to information, a little bit discomfort is 5 seconds away from a solution, because they can look up things and they will find answers and meanings. So in this sense, maybe if we were defending this thesis 15 years ago or 20 years ago, then you might have to explain more or add more. But right now, even the pasteles, no big deal. You write pasteles Puerto Rico and there it is, right? So it is interesting because the internet is allowing us to have a more foreignizing approach to translation, because they can always find it with food, and especially with food. More and more, the names of the dishes and the hold on, sweetie, I'll let you in a minute. And so it is easier to find un tamal, un pastel, un pastelón, and so all these terms. And what I like about that is that then our translations are translations. They're consciously translations, and I think that is a great step towards the dialogue between cultures that we claim to do and that we facilitate. So, Luis.
Yeah, and for a change, I'm for the many times I'm in an uncomfortable position as a subordinate culture, and I have to find resolution in whenever I have a question. So go and do your job, because I have to do mine. You make me as a dominated culture or dominated country. You force me to understand. So it's okay to make your reader uncomfortable, especially if you want to experience the real Puerto Rican experience, which is being uncomfortable.
I mean, I want to chime in with this, because would this be the same answer we give if this were 10, 20 years ago?
No, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely no.
I feel like we're in a window right now where it's still translation, but we have a lot of more open space. I mean, right now, and I feel like I have to insert him into every conversation. There's an album by an artist from Puerto Rico recently that presented to the Americans what coquito and pitorro de coco is. And now people are going to be saying pitorro and coquito like nothing. And those are our things. We don't want them like an equivalent, like coconut drink. No, coquito, like say it, coquito. And
Right.
I feel like we're living in a privileged time where we can do this and we can celebrate it. So like Luis and Aurora said, do it. Do it. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I started experiencing this when I was translating Emma Dupré de Sterling's cookbook, because it was like for me, it was a huge, this is a long time ago, it was a huge political act to keep those words in Spanish, right? And because we were translating into English, and with the food culture, with gastronomy, you have that all the time. And in gastronomic translation, you have more and more and more foreign words, and everybody now talks about gochujang, the fermented pepper sauce from the Korean cuisine, which is exquisite. Everybody, you say gochujang like you would say rice, and so people are using more and more foreign words, and I think that's fantastic because it protects the source culture. Stephanie, you wanted to add something?
Oh yeah, I wanted to respond and say thank you so much for that feedback. And you said something I only got to briefly read your comments on the thesis, but you said something that made a lot of sense to me, which was about the ramifications of domesticating the language and how that is a part of colonization. And that was really important for me to read, and I think that's something I want to consider more as I'm reviewing this translation. This thought of the domestication of language was coming from, and I had actually explained this in my preface, but then I took it out because I didn't feel it was relevant, but I read a translation of Paulo Coelho's, I can't remember which book, but from Portuguese to English, maybe 12 years ago. And the English sounded so Portuguese that it was distracting to me. And so I didn't want that to happen. So that was kind of where it was coming from. But now that you bring that up about with technology, it's so easy to look something up, especially like if I'm on my Kindle, I just tap the word and I can find even the Spanish definition of it. That's kind of changing how I'm seeing what domestication of language means. Thank you.
Yes, and in that same line, maybe consider including in your approach, which doesn't have to be for the thesis, but if you're going to keep doing this and you're going to consider that the colonial approach to translation, because as you said, Puerto Rico is the oldest colony in the world. And so translating Puerto Rican, a Spanish Puerto Rican text into English is always a little bit violent, emotionally and culturally. So maybe that, considering the colonial theories of translation, could help shed some light on your process. Let me tell you something. When I read your translation, I didn't feel that you were domesticating anything. I mean, there's some few things that I pointed out, but it was not a domesticated text as much as translations are domesticated text at the end of the day. So I think that although the theoretical premise that you present works well in the text, but maybe a reference or maybe just a brief reflection on how this is a way of colonizing always. Okay.
Yeah, and can we get over Venuti? He me da urticaria.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really, I read Venuti and I get, and it actually prompted me with the help of ChatGPT to look for alternatives. And there's so many alternatives. And there's one, and Gabriel, you thought teorías, eco-translation theory is, I had never read about it.
Send it to me because right now my mind, I don't know where it's going because I don't know how to.
Yeah, I'll send you. It's eco-translatology, translatology by Hugh Gensen, a Chinese translator. And it's not eco meaning like ecological.
Okay.
It's regarding translation as an ecosystem. And I know nothing about this. I just read like quickly. I'll send you the references, but there's a book in our library, a whole book on this, and that I think would sounds to me like more appropriate approach, because it's more like encompassing or more. Yeah, Venuti me da urticaria. And it's too binary. It's too no, and it's old. It's very old. There's so many other Evan Soar, ¿cómo se llama? Polysystem theory. There's other things after Venuti. So yeah, that's something you might want to read on to get inspired on your future versions of this text.
Thanks.
Okay. I loved what you did, that how you transposed his 3 questions for writing to your 3 questions for translating. I think that it's very sharp, and considering the audience, it's one of the most important things that we try to tell our students and to teach our students. Who are you translating for? Okay. And I was going to ask you, because you said English speakers in the United States, maybe you could even refine it a little bit more. By English speakers in the United States, do you include the diaspora who would perhaps not know Spanish, but who are familiar and they have a relative in the island or a relative that recently arrived in the States that represents that culture, right? So maybe you want to refine if you included the diaspora in that, because the decisions would vary a little bit. It's not the same to translate something to a culture that is not known, that is totally alien to the reader, than to translate it where the only obstacle between that reader and the text is the language, right? So maybe, I don't know if you want to tell me if you consider that or if it's something you're going to consider.
Yes, I do include the diaspora, and that's partly why I decided not to use footnotes, and also in the areas where I added in little explanations, I tried to keep them as fluid as possible and make them seem like part of the story, because I don't want to kind of dumb down. I don't want to be explaining things to people who already know what all of this means. So I tried to make all of those sound natural with the diaspora specifically in mind.
Okay. There were some of your, what you call domestication, which I would not call domestication, adding that the mountainous center is the Cordillera Central. I don't see that as a domestication, and I see it as helping your reader to understand it. And so those kind of add-ons, right? The things that you added, or those brief explanations, I totally agree with them, and I use them myself when I translate a text that, especially diasporic Puerto Rican text, I do use it a lot. There are 2 decisions of explanation that I would like to comment. One is the one that you, and I think you read this, the one that you said, the city known, or the part known as the old city. He doesn't specifically, I mean, he doesn't talk about Old San Juan specifically. No, he doesn't use the name Viejo San Juan in the story. And the old city is the old city. I don't know that adding the part of the known as the old city is necessary, because it is the old city. And then you added quotation marks, and I think that might alter more the text than, and it doesn't add much. If he would have said la parte a la que se refieren al Viejo San Juan, and el Viejo San Juan as a proper noun, then I would have used it. But he just says la ciudad antigua, okay? And also with Borincana, I would have just left Borincana. I would not have inserted the indigenous people, because Borincano is also the Jíbaros, Borincano is also the African descendants of Borincano. We are all Borincanos. So adding the indigenous Taínos maybe excludes other groups of people that are as Borincanos as them. So it's an addition that does not add much to the text. So I don't, and I'm talking about these two specific examples because of what we're discussing now, which is the domestication or the foreignization. Another comment that I wanted to okay, let's talk about debatir el cobre, which is still, I would say that is one of the big translation problems in this text. And I don't know if you saw my comment, but
it's been almost 58 years since it took me to understand
lo que es batir el cobre.
lo que es batir el cobre, because I always was batiendo like that, and I would never understand. I was like, why they say batir el cobre?
Okay, so
So thank you for helping me understand that.
So I suggested, and maybe you could include it in your references. There's this fantastic Tesoro de la Lengua puertorriqueña, this dictionary that I put it in the comments in your translation, and it explains what it is to batir el cobre. Okay, and yes, it is a difficult idiom to translate. Definitely. And the eliminating the rico from Puerto Rico in that fantastic short story, you are treating Puerto Rico like a suffix, and I don't know that I'm convinced about it being a suffix. There's a joke that when we say, if we talk about Puerto Rico in English, we call it Richport, right? Maybe it would not be a bad idea to think about the rich, removing the rich and using the word rich. You don't use the word rich in your translation. So maybe you could think about how to insert the word rich with Puerto Rico, with a little addition, Puerto Rico, the rich port, or Puerto Rico, parenthesis, the rich port, or Puerto Rico, comma, rich port. And then we eliminate the rich, they eliminated the rich from the port, so maybe play with that, because it is not that complicated. It's not a terrible negotiation to translate rico for rich, a rich port. And maybe you could play a little bit with that.
Can I ask you more about your previous comment
Yes.
about batir el cobre?
Uh-huh.
Is your main comment that the meaning is not coming across in an equivalent way?
Give me a minute. Okay. Okay. Because batir el cobre is also to know what's going on. Give me a second. I'm looking for this. Okay. En el tesoro lexicográfico, batir el cobre is also to know what you're doing. Okay? Saber cómo se bate el cobre is to know the intríngulis of something. So, porque batir el cobre is usually used to refer to that you know how this is done.
Because you've
I
done it.
never read it as a physical exertion. I have never.
No.
I don't know if it is possible, but to me, batir el cobre is not so much related to a physical exertion, but to knowing what you have, what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Okay, así es como se bate el
Así
cobre.
es como se bate el cobre.
Exacto.
That's the way you do it.
Exactly. So in that sense, and that's why I suggested that you go over the tesoro lexicográfico to see if you can play a little bit more with it.
Yeah.
In English, if you don't know that the word batir el cobre is in the source text, your translation flows. But since I am your professor, I have to say, well, here I don't know if this is as accurate as it happened, like physical exertion, doing something. I've never seen it as effort. I've always seen it as knowledge, and also astucia. O sea, saber cómo se bate el cobre is that you know the intríngulis, you know the saber cómo se bate el cobre. O sea, that's it, Yeah. So maybe give it some thought. Okay.
And it also has a sense of real, o sea, of reality check. It's like así es como se batalla. It's not like you think it is. This is the way it actually is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
it also kind of has a sense of reality check.
Yeah, and in fact, in el tesoro lexicográfico, it has batir el cobre, but it has saber cómo batir el cobre as another entry. Okay, so yes, I think that maybe you could look a little bit into that. Okay.
Yeah, talking about tesoro, did you know about that reference, the tesoro lexicográfico?
Yes.
Yeah,
I learned it from one of you.
Okay.
Yeah,
don't
but
remember who.
I missed it. I think it would have been useful in certain instances of this text.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I didn't see it. I'm pretty sure I didn't see it in your references either. So I think that would have helped you, because it really helps clearing up. It's not 100%.
Old. It is old also, and
Yeah, but it's I think it's been updated.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but it's useful. It's really useful. Tesoro.pr for those who are listening and don't know about it.
okay. And then the other one is the batata. We live in times of cornucopias of batatas in Puerto Rico. Maybe we have too many batatas, but the batata, as you describe it, you talked about an inept and futile person in public office, and that is true, but that is incomplete. The person arrived there because of their connections. Okay,
And
so
mostly political.
right, political or familiar, which is worse,
Yeah.
because then they have absolutely no
Yeah,
knowledge.
but la batata política, ¿cómo es? La batata política es un lambeculo de un partido que he was, o sea, there's a lot coming in this following weeks into the government because we've just finished an election cycle. So hay un montón de lambeculo que are gonna get a job now.
Yeah,
A job.
or even family members. I mean,
Yes.
people with no experience. So just make sure that in your definition of batata, you include that they are not only inept, but that they got to that chair because of personal or political connections. Okay?
Sí.
That to me is very important because it is very sad. And it's very sad that, for instance, they would give some positions to batatas because they think that they're harmless.
Yeah, and it's we call them batatas, but it's batata política.
Batata política, right? Because
The política is being ¿cómo se dice? Elidido. Pero I have a friend who worked with me in the pavilion in Spain in '92, and he called them. He spoke German, so he called them politicians sus Kartoffel.
Yeah, kartoffel from potato. But I wanted to also explain, it is not the same as a political appointee, because a political appointee would be someone doesn't have the fact that they, yeah, it's just a appointment. The batata has the connotation that they're inept. They don't have the skills to function in that position, but they're there because of la pala, which which is just a connection, like Aurora said.
Right. Okay. And I like what you did with the aleph. I think it's very ingenious.
Thanks.
Yeah, but translation is a sad.
Luis doesn't like it.
No, it's not that I don't like it. It's sad because there's things you just cannot. Charro. It doesn't. Qué charrería, o sea.
It doesn't translate.
Yeah, I guess charro even implies bad taste, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know sea charro, you know. So yeah, but anyway,
I had to ask a lot of
Being
friends
cheesy
to
or
help
being-
me understand charro.
yeah, it is. Yes,
It's a very deep concept.
yes. And I think that it might even have come to substitute the word cafre, because when I was young, people would say, no seas cafre. But thanks to a lot of political work that the African descendant community did, they started pointing out words that people not knowing use, which are racist. And so cafre was substituted by charro. And because when I was young, there were no charros. Charros is something that is the result of the African descendants pointing out that we, not knowing, use words that are racist. Okay, and I remember when I first realized that the word denigrar is a racist word. Okay, denigrate is a racist word because you're lowering something to the category of black, you know, negro. And so in that sense, it's interesting because it's a word that is more recent. The use of the word for this is more recent, okay? We could say the same about, well, is charro Mexican or is charro from Salamanca? Why charro, right? But certainly it's a word that has evolved, the usage has evolved. And what else? Luis, do you want to add something to the preface?
No. I was I just wanted to say thank you for, apart from thanking you for considering me to be one of your readers. I think your presentation now was very thoughtful, not only for ourselves, but for our audience. So I thank you for that. It was very well organized, and I wanted to exhortar, to, how do you say that? Exhortar. Advice, no,
Suggest?
Request?
suggest,
Suggest?
yeah, exhortar. The students that are viewing this to take a look at your preface. Probably there's things that you should have or could have discussed in it, but I commend you on it being very well organized, very well thought through. It was just as reading your as Aurora said, your text reads so easily. I read it like that, very, 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 very. It was.
Yeah.
It has problems. It has mistakes. It has things in it, but it's such an easy read. And your preface is very well organized. When I saw the heading on grammatical, the translation, the grammatical, how do you call it?
The differences?
Yeah, I was like, oh, come on, you're gonna get me bored again with that same discussion. And it's actually, I think, one of the few times where grammar is actually a translation problem. Grammar is grammar differences between languages is not are normally not translation problems. Those are the things that translators have to do. You have to translate. You have to change the wording or the order of the words or whatever differences there are in the grammar of the different languages. But your discussion on why this is a translation problem and how you approached it is really, really good. That specific story was very, very, very hard. And it's another sad story. Another sad translation story, because when you look at, ¿dónde está? Hold on. When you look at, where is this? Subordinadas sustantivas. That goes far beyond the grammar. Algo sustantivo es algo básico, es sustantivo.
But it also weights. It also has weight. So it's more than a noun. No, es más de sustantivo to refer to a noun.
Es de sustancia.
Exacto, es sustancia, exacto.
O sea que ese texto tiene tanto subtexto. O sea, subordinada sustantiva del complemento agente. Subordinada sustantiva del suplemento o del régimen. O sea, that's very political. O sea, subordinada sustantiva del suplemento o régimen. Piensa que sería mejor expulsarla. And I think well, you have to sit down and learn Spanish if you want to really understand that and live here as you did.
I can't tell you how many months I spent trying to translate that story. And I actually had considered not translating it and having it in the book in Spanish with explanations and footnotes of the Spanish, so to actually have it as a Spanish grammar lesson for English speakers. But
that's a good alternative. But
In
it's
the
going to
end,
be
I
a
decided to
very long
translate it,
lesson.
but yeah. Because it's a work of fiction, I decided in the end to not do that, but that was one of the options that I considered.
That story can be a whole semester course on translation and history and that, yeah. So anyway, going back to your preface, I really think it's very well structured. It was perfectly. I think it's an exemplary preface. So I congratulate you on that. I think that's. I mean, I have comments, and I go all over the place with Venuti because that really bothers me whenever I see him.
He's a pit bull. He won't let go. He won't
No,
let go.
I won't. Yeah, and I of course, since I didn't have much to say, I've run all over the formatting of your document. There's 7,000 corrections on the formatting, so you can have fun with that. So that's what I wanted to say about the preface.
Thank
Okay.
you.
And Luis and I were commenting this last night because we do talk about you students a lot.
Yeah, we do.
You have no idea of how much of our mind, space, and time you take up, very lovingly and respectfully. As Luis was saying, your translation reads very smoothly, and I think that for the most part, I agree with most of your decisions. What I found, and I think that Luis agrees with me in this, the one-liner short stories for the people who are watching, they're two micro stories that the title and the sentence that makes up the story is just one sentence, right? And this is something that I wanted to point from another story too. I don't know if it worked that well, the one that says,
Well, if I
the one de ojalá, let me look for ojalá, wait a minute. No, ojalá was if, right?
While
Yes.
if only
Okay,
fine.
while if only pined, okay? So what if only pined? Let me look for the source text here. Okay. I think that the story is the following. And let me read.
Mientras ojalá se quedó llorando, yo la saqué a bailar.
Okay, mientras ojalá se quedó añorando, yo la saqué a bailar, right? Here I think that if only is personified and is feminicized or feminized. So the sentence, if I were going to translate this story, I would say, while if only pined, I asked her to dance. Porque yo la saqué a bailar. Ese la is referring to ojalá. Okay, and you could see the ojalá personified as a woman hoping in the dance someone would ask her to dance, or she was hoping or thinking about someone, and while she was there languishing. And I also said maybe instead of pining, I suggested a couple other words, and of course I do this because I love doing this, but I said longing or languishing maybe. And
Ojalá,
while she was there doing that, I asked her to dance. And so ojalá, which is a longing, because ojalá is longing, I asked her to dance. So she has to stop longing.
I read it differently.
Oh yeah, you did?
Yeah, it's for me, and this is sad. Ojalá is a guy.
No,
Ojalá
que
is a
dice, yo
guy.
la saqué a bailar.
Ojalá, bueno, ojalá yo me atreviera a sacarla a bailar. And he was thinking about how I look at it differently. You
So this is an issue that actually I had with Steph because I saw it as longing as well, but I told it to Steph and she had a different interpretation and therefore a different translation of it and the reasoning behind it. So if it's a matter of interpretation, where do we go from there? Because it's
No, no, no,
exactly.
no. I mean, to me, ojalá, yo la saqué a bailar is referring to ojalá. And besides, I mean, the la, ojalá, yo la saqué, it's to me it was evident, but I'm not saying that it's the only possibility. But what do you think, Steph?
So I also really debated about what the meaning was, and at first I thought la was ojalá, but the storyline that way didn't make sense to me because I thought of it as if only was pining, I kind of grabbed life by the horns and went out to dance, and ojalá stayed at home pining. That's what I thought the mientras was telling me, and so I was very confused about who la was. And I taught Aurora, you're muted. I'm not sure if you wanted to add something, but I did end up talking to Ricardo briefly about it. We didn't get too into it because we were talking about batir el cobre. But his brief explanation was that ojalá is passive and while I acted. And so to me, I saw them as ojalá wanted to go dancing with someone, but they didn't have the courage to ask someone while I did. And so the moral is to go out and act instead of staying at home.
That's how I
This
read
might
it.
be one that I'll talk to him a little more about it to see what his intentions were.
But I think that, and okay, let's then talk about ambiguity. It is la, definitely. I read it one way, we all in a different way, and that's the beauty of a. So let's focus on the ambiguity. Then, instead of asking someone to dance, since the la is a feminine, however you slice it, yo la saqué a bailar is you ask a woman or a feminine figure to dance. Then I ask her to dance. I asked her if she wanted to dance with me, or I would, instead of saying somebody or someone, I would use her. And then
so that actually maintains the ambiguity.
And then it is ambiguous because la
I like it.
refers to a feminine subject. And I think that keeping the ambiguity will solve the problem. Who is la? Who is her? Who is this her that you asked to dance? Okay. Yeah, I would insist on that because I think that the somebody doesn't convey the ambiguity, and that's it's part of the beauty of this text.
Yes, again, somebody specific.
Yeah,
I like the idea. Gracias.
I would, yeah, and then
yeah, la mala espina.
you can go there if you want.
Deja ver, ¿qué fue lo que yo puse? Hold on. Yeah, this one, the problem I have with your translation is that your translation is 2 sentences. And the original story is a single sentence. Eras una mala espina que sirvió para rascarme.
It's a subordinate.
A subordinate.
No, not another subordinate. Well, my translation is 1 sentence. Once upon a thorn in my side, I used it to scratch an itch.
I read it as two sentences. Once upon a thorn in my side is one sentence, and then I used it to scratch an itch.
Yeah, but I is always capitalized, so it could be
Yeah.
confusing.
Well, so technically, there's no verb in once upon a thorn in my side. So it's not a sentence. It is.
It's a
Is it
it's a it's
that
an
there's a
ad it's
pause
an
that you don't like, or
it's an adverb clause.
It's like a title.
okay.
It doesn't. It doesn't help me read it as a sentence.
I think it has to do more with rhythm, is what you're saying, Luis? The
Yeah.
rhythm of the whole thing? Okay.
Yeah.
So if it were something like, once there was a thorn in my side that I used to scratch an itch, would that solve the kind of the thing that's getting you?
You're on the right track. It's not the solution, but it's I think it's the right track. Yeah. Yeah, those are I said you chose a hard text, very, very difficult text.
Yeah, I actually didn't. In the 16 stories I translated, some of my favorite stories in the book I left out because I felt that they would be easier to translate, and I wanted this discussion for all of the hard ones.
I know. Yeah. Yeah, that it's not it's a good translation. It just requires more. It's
indescribable is what he's trying to say. It's indescribable. No, but
yeah.
I think I see what you're saying, that to me these two, the title and the story go together because I've seen them together so many times, but it's not actually, it doesn't make sense as a full sentence.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
What if you put a comma at the end of the title, in the title? What if the title has a comma? Since we're dealing with subordinates. Would it work? I'm asking, I'm not even daring to suggest, but.
Ay, es que en español que sí que para rascarme. Y también la mala espina. It's not a thorn.
Sí,
Oh.
sí.
Ah, it's
it's because
How
in
can I
English,
get closer to espina than thorn?
I know.
No, but
mala espina.
But malaspina in English, in Spanish, more like when you have a thorn on your side, that something's nagging you, or there's also a bad feeling involved about something that's giving
Exactly.
you a bad vibe about it.
Es
It's
como un
not,
presentimiento malo,
Yeah.
tengo una mala
yeah.
espina. Sí.
There's a combination
Y
of
eso me da
uses.
como.
Let me tell you, this story writer is genius. I think he's. I'm an instant fan of his now.
Mhm.
Totally.
It's a premonition mixed with, yeah, a bad omen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and when I talked to him about this story, he said it also for him had a nuance of someone who actually wishes, like someone who has bad intentions towards you.
Yeah, because you say, esa persona me da mala espina, eso me da mala espina, means that you're suspicious about that person or that situation. I'm going to do this. Ay, eso me da mala espina. So it is kind of suspicious.
Sí, y entonces it's kind of making fun of la mala espina too.
Right.
I just scratch with it. I don't care. I don't care about it.
Yeah, I'm looking at my notes of what other idioms I considered, and I was looking at something smells fishy. I have a bad feeling about this. It raises my hackles, but I couldn't get it to work with the scratching.
Yeah.
Or with turning it around and using it for something good.
Yeah. It is very.
What was the second one you said?
Something smells fishy. I have a bad feeling about this. It
Something
raises
smells
my
fishy,
hackles.
and then
What
you-
about
Something
Some-
smells fishy and I ate it.
So I cooked, so
I
I
cooked
grilled,
it.
I fired up the grill.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
something
Yeah.
like a fishy bone instead of a espina, espina
Something
as not
smells-
as in a thorn, but it's an a fish bone.
So I used the bones to pick my teeth.
No, pero como algo fishy. I don't know. This is, I mean, I don't know that we're gonna find a solution
No.
without boring everybody with this. But maybe if it's fishy and espina también is the bone of a fish, maybe you could play with that. I don't know. I'm not saying anything. I'm just doing the brainstorming that we do when we
Yeah.
encounter these huge problems.
Yeah, I'm taking notes.
And I do want to ask you, because you transcribed the source text for us. I have a Word document of the source text.
Yes, I sent it. Mhm.
Okay. And I loved the Fray Bartolomé de las Casas. I
Talk to us about that. Your medievalist view
of what?
de la historia de Bartolomé.
Ay, a mí me encantó, me fascinó, me encanta como I was telling Luis that you were not born yet, Steph, but there was a time when there was no email, and around 1990 something, I was just starting at the university, we got the email. And I got my first email account, and I was so fascinated by it that I created with friends a lot of characters that would travel in the internet, all amazed by what they were seeing and writing and being able to do. Now, and they were called the cyber nuns. And so we had the cyber nuns, and we had several characters. So, and I used to imitate the style because I love medieval literature and I studied it. So I think this short story is genius.
Confess your character.
Well, there were a few. There was Sos Remedios de las Angustias, and there were several. A lot of fun. So I wanted to ask you, because I don't know if there is an error in the source text, and that changes a little bit the translation. In where it says, it's on page 15 of the source text, the paragraph that begins, de felicísimo estado entonces, y sin malicia alguna que sobresaliera, ingiriendo empanadilla, desconocerse, si de pizza. I think there's an error, because I think it should read desconócese, si de pizza o queso o carne. Do you have the original? Check that.
Yes.
Because it's not Gustavo who is unconcerned as to whether he's eating a pizza or a carne empanadilla. It's that our narrator
We don't know.
doesn't know what
Okay.
the feeling of that empanadilla is. And it's a very typical construction of medieval Spanish, that you say, desconócese, no desconocerse. And that infinitive kind of confused me. So just check that out. And I think it is that that we don't know what the feeling of the empanadilla was. Okay.
Okay.
And then.
And you know who Jimena Cristina Bazán is?
No.
Do you know who Cristina Bazán is? Look for Cristina Bazán.
Okay.
It's two words. It's Cristina Bazán. Yeah. And I find that he does.
Yeah, go ahead. Sí.
No, I'm sorry. That he has a lot of references to popular culture. And it's interesting because I think I think he's younger than some of the of the television and cultural popular culture references that he does, but he knows it. And with Cristina Bazán, I also wanted to comment that the tooth, the short story, The Tooth, the name of the detective is the name of the author of the song. And that is it's Me lo dijo Adela.
Yeah, that was a reference I missed until I just
and
read their comments now.
Yeah, and I was telling Luis last night, we were talking about Otilio and whatnot, and I was telling him, it's normal that you didn't know that reference. As when I translate more contemporary and younger writers, there are so many references that could just pass by me. And what this tells me is, look up everything. Look up everything. Just look up write the string in Google and look it up. Because we cannot know all the references, but to the students that are listening to us.
And I've translated things that have had errors that I just discovered because I was curious.
Yeah.
I was just, let me find out about this thing he's talking about or whoever he's talking about. And just out of curiosity, it's not that I want to check the references. It's not that I want to verify anything. It's just like, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
And then when I do the checkup, it's like, oh, there's a mistake. There's like, I've seen a mistake I found a mistake in one of the ¿cómo se llama? In an exhibition, the little things that have the description of it's a picture about a river and it had the wrong river. Totally the wrong river. It's not and it was an error of the person that edited it. Because the author, the photographer actually knew where he was standing, and he actually knew that it was which river it was. I just was curious about it, and when I suddenly said, "Oops, it's not that river; it's the other one," and it was somewhere in Guatemala, it's nothing I knew about. I was just curious. So you make sure you check everything.
Yeah, and I think that the other about that Fray Bartolomé's text, there is one observation that I would like to make, and it's that although it simplifies the reading of the translation, sometimes I wish that you would have kept longer sentences, because that is more like the style. And I was telling Luis, when I translated Robinson Crusoe, there are sentences that take up a page and a half. And these were originally written in English, so you could maybe play a little bit, because there's also, again, the discomfort in the reader reading these things. There's an otherness about it that it would help to keep in the translation. So maybe maybe if I would have translated this, I would have kept some longer sentences, just to play with the style.
Yeah.
and to do the estrangement, right? To make it more, to set a time distance between the reader and the narrator of the story.
And even in other parts of the translation, I don't remember where I didn't mark it, but I just noticed it, and there's a I think it's a whole paragraph or a long part of a paragraph, which he divides it using semicolons, and you change that into single sentences. I don't remember if I marked it, but I revisit those things.
Mhm.
Yeah, you can use longer sentences. Yeah. I have a question. We are on the Gustavo's. Él le llamó macharrán en varias ocasiones. Tell me about your decision to translate macharrán as bastard.
Let me pull up my notes for that one.
Huh?
I'm pulling up my notes for that one. I don't remember particularly my process.
Because I don't see a macharrán as a bastard.
I mean, a macharrán is a bastard, but not in that way. But it's not what it. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, and I actually used ChatGPT for that. I copied ChatGPT's I did copy it on my comments, so you can see that. And it also has different proposals. But yeah, give me your take on macharrán and macharranería.
I don't I'm not familiar with the word macharrán I hadn't come across it before, and so I had to do some reading about it to try to understand what I meant, and so I don't feel like I have a deep understanding of what it means. But I tried to think of, this is an area where I kind of moved a little bit away from the source and tried to think of what an upset wife might call her husband when she's trying to insult him. Especially
Not
because
necessarily. Some men might not necessarily feel insulted if they be called a macharrán. Some of them will be very happy to be called macharrán.
okay, let me re-look up this word.
Yeah. And I personally dig macharranerías.
Watch it, Luis. You
In
might
some-
get.
yeah,
You
in
might
some
get. You might.
comments.
Definitely, some of them
You might be
cherish.
canceled. You might be canceled, Luis.
No, bueno,
Don't even cherish.
it's a very personal context.
No, you and I, you've spoken to me about it in the past.
Yeah,
And
so I mean,
yeah.
yo,
I know how you mean it. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily what the popular consensus is right now, but
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Note-
but that, I mean, I consulted with ChatGPT, and it's pretty interesting. It's take on macharrán and the option. So I just copied what it said. So you can take a look at that. Did you, by any chance, did you use any AI or anything to aid you in this? Are you using it?
No, I actually wasn't sure if it was allowed or not. We're talking a lot about that at work and how much we can use AI at work, and so I just stayed away from it for this one.
And I don't generally typically use AI for especially translations, but good to know that it's we can use all tools and we can take that literally and anything at our disposal.
I
But
use it for I mean, I consulted. So
but
what do you think?
I think it's the ethical part that I still have some issues with.
Yeah, there's that's another
that's
thing.
fine.
But I haven't read, so I don't, this is not an excuse. So I haven't read much on anything about the ethics. So, and it's not I'm not accusing myself. So I have not pondered that, which is something I should do. But anyhow, it's just a tool. It's I'll use it to help me. Sometimes you need inspiration. It'll help you give you ideas. And it's everywhere. It's in places you even don't know about it. So I mean, unless you're a real ¿cómo se dice? Neurotic reader, and you read all of the terms and conditions whenever you get a prompt to accept terms and conditions. I think it's quite difficult yeah, it's quite difficult to I mean, even now when you do a search in Google, it'll automatically insert AI summaries, and probably you can turn it off if you don't want to use it, but it's going to be everywhere. So it's something I use it to consult, and it helps me.
Yeah, I use it a lot at work to understand a scientific concept if I'm having trouble
Yeah,
simplifying it to a level that I can understand it.
yeah.
And I could see using it as a tool in translation.
Yeah.
And using it to consult. But in terms of a thesis project in particular, I didn't know if the UPR. I haven't seen anything coming out from the UPR as to what their stance is. So I just avoided it this time. But
I stand by the part of it's part of the tool set.
Mhm.
You have to know how it works, and you have to decide, because what Gabriel brought is an important aspect of it. We need also to discuss that, and I haven't read, but I have heard, because we've had the AI symposium or something last semester we organized.
And to those of you hearing us out there, we're not casting any judgments as to AI. We recognize that we're in an in-between of evolving and emerging technologies. And as like every technology, people fear it at first, but then it slowly becomes something that becomes a tool of our tool belt. I'm not also saying that the ethics, I'm on the fence because of the ethics. I'm also saying that I am cautious with it because of the ethics of what I read, but I'm not against using it. I use it myself in my other work as well for scenarios and team building strategies. So it's just that we're having the discussion in front of you, like what to do, what do we do, where do we hold, and but it's allowed. It's allowed, yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Los panchos. What else? No sé. Aurora, you
I
have
could talk about this
Yeah, we could be
for even
here.
longer, but it's
Yeah.
3:45.
Yeah, we've been 2 hours here, right? No, but it's just
We've been-
because
yeah.
it's good. Because it's good. We know it's
It
a
is.
lot to give it to talk about. So, Steph, is there anything you would like to address in addition to the comments? Anything that also the judges might want to mention in addition?
Again, this was a fun thesis to read. Fun and
Yay, thank you.
very good translation.
Yeah. All right. So, Barbara, everyone, what we're gonna do now is we just ended with the presentation in the comments section of the defense. The judges and I will now be separate into another room in which we will.
I'm not a judge. I'm a reader.
I call them the judges because for the
They're judging
deliberation
me.
that you're gonna cast a judgment right now. So, and I took the word from like a game show, like the judges will now choose.
Yeah.
So okay, so that's
Yeah.
where I'm using it for. So the readers and I will be, locked away in a different area of the internet so we can find a final decision on this. So when we know it's a great word, we just want to know, bureaucracy and paperwork. So Barbara, shortest conversation I've had for the discussion for a final grade on a thesis. But Steph, you are maybe like every excellent student will have your doubts about your own quality, but we don't. With the people that work around you and have worked with you, we're pretty sure of the quality of student, of person, of your creativity and everything that you are and what you give. And there was no doubt in this. Congratulations, Steph. You passed with sobresaliente because there's no doubt in anyone's mind of the type of work that you had to, undertake for this. Not only that, but also you being a person whose Spanish is not your first language, taking a text like this, your choice of text, someone who's not widely known, like I told the other readers, it's not a refrito, it's not an author that has been over translated by many. It's someone that you decided to bring out of the darkness, and we know that texts acquire new life when you translate them, especially if you translate them for new audiences. And you've done that with this text and with this author. I hope that the people seeing this become interested in reading this author, be it in Spanish or English, because it is just a joy to read it, but it's also a joy to see your translation, to read your translation and appreciate it because it flows so well. So congratulations, Steph. You deserve everything and more. Is there anything you would like to say about this?
Thank you so much. And I wanted to just thank all of you at the PGT. I'm constantly impressed by how much my professors know. And I've learned so much from all of you. And most of my classmates in the program are from Puerto Rico. And so to be a gringa, I mean, on this theme of colonization, I'm coming in from the US to a colonized country, and I try to be as aware as I can of the implications of that. And many of you have helped me talk through that, and also have just accepted me with open arms into the program and taught me so much, and have helped me build community at the PGT, and have let me try out some things whenever the students, we were having a hard time with something, you listened to us and you helped brainstorm with us possible solutions, and we tried a bunch of those solutions, and some of them worked and some of them didn't, and that's totally fine and exactly what we want and need from a program administration and leadership. And so I appreciate that so much, that we always felt heard and always felt like there was an open door policy. And the PGT and you all specifically have brought so much into my life. And as you can see, I mean, I originally planned to come to Puerto Rico for 2 years, finish the program as quick as possible, and then go back to Boston. And here I am 3 years later, and gonna stay here for longer. And this is my life here, and this is my community. So thank you so much for that gift.
Before the readers speak, I would like to say you're saying that you're a gringa. When Puerto Ricans use that term, I know it has a negative connotation, but we usually use it to explain another, especially someone who comes with other interests to our island. You are not that. You are not a gringa to us. You are one of us. So you are, in our experience, you've experienced what it is to live here, to study here, to struggle here, because that's what the Puerto Rican experience is. You're not a gringa to us, you're family, you're one of us, okay? So, Aurora
Maybe
or Luis.
you're a Borincana.
Yeah, you're a Borincana, yes. You're a
Yeah.
Borincana. So today you get more than a master's degree. You got also the title of Borincana.
That was the ultimate goal.
Or
Anything,
Boricua, as we
Boricua.
say in the street.
Yeah.
Anything you'd like to add, Aurora, Luis?
No.
Thank you again.
No, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for. I was telling the committee. You chose a text, and this is not only for you, but for your fellow students that are listening. You chose a text that help you showcase the quality of the work you do, and so it's not the easy way out. It's the hard way that really shows who you are and how much you've progressed and how much you've learned throughout these 3 years that you've been with us. So congratulations, and I'm very proud and happy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so for those out there in the internet sphere, thank you for watching. This has been the defense of Stephanie Newton. Everyone's welcome to come here and study if you're interested. If you're from Stephanie, did you have anyone invited to see this? from your
But she
family
has a lot of
over there.
people watching.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's
Yep.
I'm not seeing the counter, so there's a lot of
No,
people
no,
watching.
there
So
are
everyone
people
out
watching.
there,
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that because I know Steph
All
was
my
kind of
family and friends are here.
was kind of shy about having people, and she told me she was kind of shy about having people actually see this, but okay, so it's very good. Everyone out there, this is the type of quality we like and we have down here. So anyone's welcome down here, your family. All right, so that'll be all.